What does a volcanic eruption have to do with the invention of the bicycle? If you're curious, stick around, because today you're going to learn the full history of the bike. The word bicycle comes from Greek. Bi means two, and kyklos means wheel, so it literally means a two-wheeled vehicle. But there isn't exactly one single inventor of the bicycle, because over time, several inventors came up with prototypes or designs of something similar. Many people claim that the oldest drawing of a bicycle was made by Leonardo da Vinci in 1493. That's right. Did you know Leonardo da Vinci was one of the greatest geniuses ever to walk this little round planet? He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, and he made dozens of sketches of machines that looked futuristic, impossible to build in his time. Things like tanks, parachutes, flying contraptions, and maybe even the bicycle. This sketch was already advanced, with pedals and a chain, features that would not appear on bicycles for centuries. But there's no consensus on whether it was actually Leonardo's work, or maybe done by one of his apprentices. Some even suspect the drawing was inserted into Da Vinci's notebook long after his death. That's the Western version of the story. But in China, they tell a completely different tale. There, the supposed inventor of the bicycle was a man named Lu Ban, an engineer and craftsman. He lived 5 centuries before Christ, almost 2,000 years before Leonardo da Vinci was even born. And the craziest part? Lu Ban is still famous in China for creating tools, ingenious machines, and clever devices. Among the things he's said to have built was a wooden vehicle with 2 wheels. The problem is, there are no drawings of this invention. So how did the rivalry between the Chinese and Italian stories begin? In reality, neither of these 2 early machines ever made it off the drawing board. We usually credit the modern bicycle to a German baron in 1817. His name was Karl von Drais, and he called his invention a running machine. But because of his name, people started calling it the Draisine. Here's an interesting twist. The Draisine appeared during a horse shortage. In 1815, a volcano in Indonesia called Mount Tambora erupted. And it wasn't just any eruption, it was extremely violent. It was an absurd explosion, one of the largest ever recorded. In fact, it doesn't even exist as a mountain anymore. All that remained was a giant crater. Thousands of people died, but that was just the direct impact. The bigger effect was that so much ash was thrown into the atmosphere that it blocked sunlight over huge parts of the planet, especially in the southern hemisphere. We don't know exactly how it looked in some regions, because very few people were documenting events at the time. But it's clear that in North America and Europe, the effects were devastating. The year 1816 even became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed, food became scarce, and keeping a horse suddenly became too expensive. And the horse, of course, was the main means of transportation at the time. As horses began dying and people could no longer afford them, another way of getting around had to be invented. And that's where the Draisine comes in. The little machine was made entirely of wood with a padded seat, but no pedals. So to move, you pushed along the ground with your feet. It's very similar to the balance bikes we use today to teach children how to ride. The wealthy in France and England, then the world's most powerful nations, showed some interest in the Draisine, but newspapers mocked it, saying it was flimsy, slow, and looked like a toy for children. Of course, at that time, they had never even seen a balance bike. The average speed on a Draisine was about 10 kilometers per hour. That's about the same as running fast. But let's be honest, running 10 kilometers is way harder. With the Draisine, you could balance, push a little, and suddenly you're gliding forward. Much easier. So, the Draisine was far less exhausting. The problem was, without pedals, it only worked well on flat terrain. Even so, Karl von Drais, during a demonstration, managed to travel 14 kilometers on his little wooden bike. But the Draisine never became a true public success. In fact, it was even banned in some cities because people considered it dangerous for pedestrians on sidewalks. About 40 years later, in the 1860s, something much closer to the bicycle we know appeared, the Velocipede. and this one was already made entirely of metal. But there was one detail that made things pretty tough. The tires had no air. It was just metal straight on the ground. Imagine that. Every time it hit a rock, the rider took a serious jolt. That's why the Velocipede also became known as the Bone Shaker. Yeah, I think that nickname fits perfectly, right? There was another uncomfortable detail. The pedals were attached directly to the wheel, like on a tricycle today. So, one turn of the pedal meant one turn of the wheel. The problem is, with a tiny wheel, each pedal stroke only moved you a short distance. That's why the front wheel on the Velocipede kept getting bigger and bigger. The larger the wheel, the farther you could travel with each push of the pedal. So imagine this. You want to go a little faster. You make the wheel slightly bigger. Then you get used to it. Next time, you make it a bit bigger again. I want more speed. I want more distance. So let's enlarge it. Bigger, 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 bigger. Until finally it reached this point. One of the strangest and most unforgettable bicycle designs in history. Before regular bikes came along, it was called the ordinary bicycle, but later became known as the Penny-Farthing. I'll admit, when I first heard that name, I thought it was odd since penny is a coin, but farthing doesn't mean farting. In English, fart without the H means fart. No, it has nothing to do with that. A penny was a 1-cent coin, and a farthing was worth a quarter of a cent. Notice that farthing has an H, while fart in English does not. And farthing simply meant a quarter of something, usually a coin. So, a farthing was 1/4 of a penny, a very tiny coin. In short, the Penny-Farthing got its name because the bike looked like two coins. A big coin for the huge front wheel, and a tiny coin for the small back wheel, the farthing. The back wheel hardly did anything. It was just for balance, so it could be small. The front wheel, though, the bigger it was, the farther you could go. Some of these wheels reached up to 1.5 meters in diameter. As you can imagine, this kind of bicycle was extremely hard to break, and a nightmare to mount or balance on, since the rider sat so high up. Some models even had a step to climb before sitting on the saddle. For this video, we couldn't bring one of these bicycles, mainly because I just had shoulder surgery, and I didn't want to risk riding one of these with a bad shoulder. If I fall, I'll end up back in surgery. Still, I think it would make a great Manual do Mundo video if we tried it, right? In the very first versions of this bicycle, the way to brake was literally putting your foot on the wheel. Later, they came up with brakes that pressed against the wheel, pretty much doing the same thing your foot would. Even then, the brakes were highly inefficient, when they worked at all. Now, picture yourself sitting high up on a wheel about 1.5 meters tall. The moment you braked or hit an obstacle, you'd go flying face first into the ground. Definitely a dangerous machine. Still, it gained some popularity. Just so you know, the very first cycling race, held in 1869 in France, was run on bikes like this. And later, in 1887, back when Brazil wasn't even a republic yet, a man named Thomas Stevens managed to travel around the world on one of these. Of course, he needed boats for the sea crossings, but he still completed the journey in about 2.5 years. Impressive, but most people wanted something safer, right? That's when the so-called safety bicycles appeared. Someone finally had the good sense to shrink that giant wheel. And instead of placing the pedals on it, they set them a bit further back, using a chain to connect the pedals to the back wheel. And that gave us something almost identical to the bicycles we ride today. Soon after, solid rubber tires were invented, which made a huge difference. Not perfect, but much better. They absorbed plenty of the bumps from dirt roads. From that point on, everything changed. Cycling even became an Olympic sport at the very first games in 1896. Just to show how much it had evolved, there were 6 cycling events in Athens in 1896. One of them was 100 kilometers long, but the wildest one required cyclists to pedal for 12 hours straight. And the winner of that race covered no less than 295 kilometers. And all of this happened about 130 years ago. Since then, the bicycle has stayed pretty much the same, with one major upgrade: the addition of gears. With gears, you can reach much higher speeds and also take on much tougher climbs. That, of course, creates a new problem. You need efficient brakes. So today, the most advanced bicycles use brakes almost identical to those on motorcycles, hydraulic disc brakes and all. And since we love inventing wild things, we also end up creating new needs. Modern bicycles have become more specialized. You have one for track racing on smooth terrain with no obstacles, another for rocky, rugged mountain trails, and even hybrids that combine both. Still, bicycles stand out as one of the cleanest forms of transportation. They produce no pollution, and on top of that, you get a solid workout. Many European cities promote cycling, and in Brazil, bike lanes and cycle paths are becoming more and more common. One thing we discovered while researching this video, and we honestly didn't know, is that Sao Paulo is the Brazilian city with the most bike lanes and paths. There are more than 700 kilometers where you can ride without mixing with cars. If you follow Manuel do Mundo, you've probably seen me taking bike rides of over 100 kilometers along the Pinheiros River, right here beside us. But to wrap up this story, a big change we're seeing lately is the rise of electric bicycles, or e-bikes with pedal assistance, like the one I showed you, where you pedal normally. But an electric motor gives you that extra push. Electric bicycles are actually not new. The first one appeared back in 1895. The issue back then was that the batteries were incredibly heavy, and just like electric cars, the idea was pretty much forgotten until lighter, modern batteries came along. Again, just like what happened with cars. Fast forward 20 years from now, and e-bikes will probably be everywhere. I bet everyone will own one. Before we wrap up, let me tell you how things escalate here at Manuel do Mundo. We were about to record this video, and Jansen was setting up the scene here. With this chair in place, he looked around and said, "Ibarre, I feel like something's missing to remind people of bicycles. Let's put one in the background." I said, "All right." Went home, grabbed my bike, and brought it here. Then I asked Jansen, "Won't that skeleton be too distracting? It usually stays in that corner, right?" And with the blue light above it, I thought it might grab too much attention, which isn't ideal. Jansen said, "Let's put a cyclist helmet on it. That'll make a funny gag for the video." All right. Jansen grabbed a helmet, so we took the skeleton down and put the helmet on it. No way. What? It was a black helmet. This very one right here. Against a background already full of black stuff, it disappeared. Didn't look good at all. So Jansen grabbed another helmet we had lying around. As you can tell, Manuel do Mundo has an endless stash of random junk. We tried the other helmet, put it on the skeleton, and now it was set. Skeleton with the helmet in the corner, bike on the other side. Then Fernando, our head of physical content, walked in and said, "Wait, so you've got the skeleton with a helmet on one side and the bicycle on the other? Why isn't the skeleton riding the bicycle?" And then, well, we spent nearly an hour figuring out how to mount the skeleton on the bike. It's all tied up with Hellerman tape back here. There's even a counterweight so the skeleton's stand doesn't tip over. The bicycle itself is also strapped down to the stand with Hellerman tape. Honestly, I'm afraid the skeleton might break. It wasn't made to ride a bike, but I think it gave the video a really cool touch. That's just how things roll here at Manuel do Mundo. If you enjoyed learning the history of bicycles, you should also check out how they're made. We filmed a Borave episode showing a bike being fully assembled, starting from cutting the aluminum tubes.